Hello, in this presentation I will summarize the key points of the article by Patrick Zavalbeascoa called Priorities and Restrictions in Translation. The purpose of the article is to present a performance model of translation based on priorities and restrictions, and thus we can raise awareness of the complexity of the translation process. There are several variables which affect translation, and we can use priorities and restrictions to map them. Broadly, these are the people involved in the translation, the contextual factors of the source text, the target text, and of the translating process, language and communication factors, and tools and norms for text analysis and production. Let us give a definition of restrictions and priorities. Restrictions refer to the constraining nature of the translator's circumstances. They prevent an absolute, universal, and constant relationship between the source and target texts. For example, we have the deadline, the choice of translator, differences between the source text and the target text, etc. Priorities reflect how the target text is to be regarded as a version of an already existing source text. From the point of view of the text producer, it is the final text's formal and functional characteristics. From the point of view of the text user, the implicit and explicit aspects the text is interpreted as having. There exists tension between restrictions and priorities. Restrictions have a limiting effect on the number and the nature of the priorities a certain text can have, whereas the priorities we establish determine just how relevant the restrictions are. They also have parameters. Restrictions and priorities share source and range as parameters. The source can be textual or contextual, and in the case of priorities, also who has established this issue as a priority. The range refers to if the restriction or priority affects the text locally, just a section, or globally, the whole text. As for restrictions, they have force. They can be strong, weak, or nil, and they have level. What features are affected? Lexical level, morphological level, etc. As for priorities, they have rank. They are arranged in a hierarchy. Priorities are restricted by those of higher rank. Functional parameter refers to the internal or contextual function of an item. So internal, for example, if it is cohesive, or contextual, for example, if it is social. Form refers to formal textual elements, such as repetitions or layout, and these are usually subordinated to a certain function. Finally, the last parameter we have is equivalence. We can have intended equivalence, intended difference, or a priority which is indifferent to equivalence. It is important to establish context-specific priorities for each translated text, because this way we do not need to resort to intuition-based decisions. We are aware of our own decisions and we can justify them. How do we go about establishing priorities? First, we must understand and interpret the source text through a translation-oriented textual analysis. We must set clear, coherent, and realistic targets for the target text. What are targets? They are the final arrangement of the priorities once we have taken into account the restrictions that we have. The quality of a translation in this context is how well it can justify its solutions and how well it fits with its evaluative criteria, which we will now see. A translation of higher quality is more priority-oriented, whereas if we have a more unjustified manipulation of the text, we will have a lower quality translation. The evaluative criteria are ambition, how many priorities we have and how high they rank, the scope, the degree to which priorities are rendered and accounted for in target text solutions, the subjectivity. The target text is more subjective as the number and the importance of priorities from the source text and the target text mismatch. And finally, the difficulty. This increases with the number of priorities we have, the number of restrictions, and also the force of these restrictions. So, to conclude, we can use priorities and restrictions for the evaluation of translations. We're referring to an ambition subjectivity scale versus a literal free scale. The translator must be able to justify the solutions chosen and used. We can evaluate translations considering all intervening factors, And finally, we may create style books with restrictions and priorities for certain types of specialized text. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.